The city lights of Chicago bled together through the rain-streaked window of the bus, a watercolor masterpiece of a life Alara Vance could see but never touch. At 23, she felt more like a ghost haunting the edges of existence than a woman living it. Each evening, the journey from the sterile, high-altitude world of Thorn Capital back to the muted reality of her cramped apartment felt like a descent, a slow-motion fall from a place she didn't belong to a place she could no longer escape. The crisp, expensive scent of her boss's world clung to her worn coat, a phantom limb of power and wealth she was paid to manage but never possess. She rested her forehead against the cool glass, the vibration of the engine, a dull thrum against her skull, trying to silence the persistent, aching question of whether this was all her life would ever be, a series of silent, dutiful transactions in service of everyone but herself. If you want to discover the impossible offer that will force her to choose between her soul and her mother's life, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you are watching from. We continue. Alara Vance was a study in careful invisibility. Her honey blonde hair was always pulled back in a severe, efficient knot, and her clothes, simple, dark, and impeccably maintained, were chosen to blend into the mahogany and chrome background of the executive suite. She held a first-class degree in art history, a passion now relegated to dusty textbooks on a shelf, and a secret Tumblr blog she updated in the lonely hours after midnight. As the executive assistant to Julian Thorne, she was a paragon of competence, a silent orchestrator of million-dollar deals and ruthless corporate takeovers. She anticipated needs before they were voiced, managed schedules with the precision of a military strategist, and served as the impenetrable wall between her formidable boss and the outside world. She was praised for her efficiency, but no one ever saw Endarta Contesh, the young woman whose dreams were quietly suffocating under the weight of her responsibilities. Her world shrank dramatically the moment she turned the key in the lock of her third-floor walk-up. The expansive, panoramic views from the 50th floor were replaced by a single window overlooking a brick wall. The air, thick with the scent of lavender-scented disinfectant and her mother's medication, was a constant, suffocating reminder of her purpose. Her mother, a former cellist whose hands were now twisted and betrayed by a degenerative illness, would be waiting in the worn armchair, her smile both a source of profound love and a symbol of Alara's gilded cage. The mounting medical bills were a silent predatory beast in their small home, devouring not just their meager savings but the very future Alara had once so carefully planned. Every paycheck, every ounce of her energy was a sacrifice laid at the altar of this love, a duty she never questioned but that was slowly eroding her from the inside out. Her virginity was her last, most private secret, a state of being less about moral conviction and more about a life lived in perpetual deferment. It was a consequence of a heart too guarded and a schedule too full of another's needs to make room for her own. In a world that felt increasingly transactional, she clung to a deeply romantic idealism, a belief that such an intimate connection should be born of something pure and profound, a meeting of souls she read about in novels and saw captured in Renaissance paintings. It was a quiet act of preservation, a small, untouched corner of her life she refused to compromise. She had simply never met anyone who saw past the efficient assistant or the dutiful daughter to the woman underneath. Her body and her heart remained a locked garden, waiting for a connection she was beginning to fear was a childish fantasy. The emptiness was a quiet companion, most present in the deep stillness of the night. After her mother was asleep, Alara would sit with a cup of chamomile tea, the glow of her laptop illuminating a face etched with a weariness that belied her years. She scrolled through images of Florentine art, of sun-drenched Italian piazzas, and felt a pang of loss so sharp it was physical. This was the life she had been meant for, one of beauty, history, and passion. Instead, she was trapped in an endless loop of spreadsheets, prescription refills, and the silent, crushing weight of responsibility. It wasn't a loud, dramatic sorrow, but a slow, creeping grayness that muted the colors of her world. She was a spectator to her own youth, watching it slip through her fingers like fine sand while she stood perfectly still, afraid to move and risk it all collapsing. The contrast between her two worlds was a form of daily psychological whiplash. At Thorn Capital, she walked on floors of polished Italian marble that cost more than her mother's annual medical care. She scheduled appointments in minimalist glass-walled conference rooms, where men decided the fates of thousands of employees with the cold detachment of gods playing a game. The silence in the executive wing was different from the silence in her apartment. It was heavy, laden with unspoken power and the hum of immense wealth. She was the keeper of Julian Thorne's keys to this kingdom, his passwords, his private numbers, his corporate strategies, yet she was fundamentally an outsider. She saw the opulence, the casual power, the freedom that money bought, and it served only to highlight the narrow confines of her own existence, making her feel the bars of her cage more acutely. The breaking point arrived not with a bang, but with the crisp, quiet sound of an envelope being torn open. It was another letter from the insurance company, its dense, bureaucratic language, a polite but firm rejection of coverage for a new experimental treatment her mother's doctor had recommended. The number at the bottom of the page was astronomical, an impossible figure that seemed to mock her years of sacrifice. Staring at the cold, black ink, Ilara felt the last of her carefully constructed composure begin to fracture. The quiet ache of her life was no longer ignorable. It was a roaring in her ears. She walked to the small, clouded mirror in the hallway and looked at her reflection. For a moment, she saw a stranger, a tired, pale woman with haunted eyes. And in that moment, a dangerous, terrifying thought sparked in the darkness. She would do anything to change this. Anything. The door to their apartment closed with a soft, definitive click, a sound that always felt like a lock turning on her day. The air inside was a familiar, heavy tapestry woven from the scents of old books, her mother's rosewater perfume, and the sharp, sterile undertone of antiseptic solutions. It was the smell of love and decay intertwined. Unlike the vast, impersonal spaces of Thorne Capital, every object here was saturated with history and need. Her mother's cello, its wood, dark and lustrous, stood silent in the corner, a beautiful, heartbreaking monument to a life of music that had been stolen by failing nerves and betraying muscles. The small living room was dominated by the hospital-grade adjustable bed that had replaced their old sofa, a constant clinical reminder of the illness that dictated the rhythm of their lives, shrinking their world down to these four walls. Her mother, Eleanor, would be propped against a mountain of pillows, her smile a fragile but radiant thing. Her hands, once capable of drawing such sublime, heartbreaking notes from the cello, now rested limply in her lap, their fine bones a delicate, painful sculpture. "How was your day, my star?" she would ask, her voice a little weaker than the day before. Ilara would recount a sanitized version of her hours, omitting the casual cruelty of her colleagues or the crushing weight of Julian Thorne's silent disapproval. She would help her mother with her dinner, cutting her food into small, manageable pieces, and they would talk about trivial things, a bird on the windowsill, a story on the news. But beneath the gentle current of their conversation was a powerful, unspoken undertow. Ilara's life force was being transfused directly into her mother's, and both of them knew it. After Eleanor was settled for the night, Ilara would begin her second shift. She'd sit at the small, wobbly kitchen table under the flickering fluorescent light, the day's mail spread before her. It was a ritual of dread. The stark white envelopes with their transparent windows held not letters, but judgments. Invoices, collection notices, and insurance statements formed a paper mountain she could never seem to conquer. She would meticulously enter each new debt into a worn ledger, the columns of red ink bleeding together like open wounds. The numbers were abstract and yet terrifyingly real, representing treatments, medications, and therapies that were keeping her mother alive, but simultaneously burying Ilara under a landslide of financial obligation. Each night, she felt a little more of her own future being signed away, collateral for a debt of love she was terrified she could never fully repay. Their neighborhood in Pilsen was a world away from the gleaming steel and glass of the Loop. Here, the buildings were brick and stone, their facades etched with the stories of generations of working-class families. Murals bloomed with vibrant color on the sides of bodegas and laundromats, a testament to a defiant, creative spirit that Ilara deeply admired but felt entirely separate from. The sounds were different, too. The distant wail of a siren, the rhythmic pulse of music from a passing car, the laughter of children playing in the street. It was a community humming with a life she observed from behind a window. While her colleagues at Thorne Capital discussed weekend trips to the Hamptons and ski resorts in Aspen, Her own geography was limited to the 3-block radius around her apartment, a perimeter defined by the pharmacy, the grocery store, and the bus stop. The physical act of caregiving was an intimate, relentless dance. It was the gentle massaging of her mother's stiff hands, the careful brushing of her thinning hair, the daily litany of pills sorted into a plastic organizer. It was reading aloud from Jane Austen novels until her own voice grew hoarse, and it was being a quiet, steady presence during the long, painful nights when sleep wouldn't come. Ilara performed these tasks with a devotion that was absolute, a love so fierce it left no room for resentment. Yet, in the quiet moments, she would catch her reflection in the darkened window and see the exhaustion etched around her eyes. She was 23, but the lightness of youth felt like a distant country she had only read about. Her body was a vessel for duty, her energy a resource to be managed and dispensed for another's survival. Sometimes, a memory would surface with the clarity of a photograph. She and her mother in Millennium Park, years ago, before the diagnosis. Eleanor's hands were strong and sure as she pointed out the architectural details of the Pritzker Pavilion, her voice full of passion and life. They had shared a dream then. After Ilara graduated, they would take a trip to Italy. They would stand before Botticelli's Venus in the Uffizi Gallery, eat gelato in a sun-drenched Roman piazza, and listen to an orchestra under the stars in Verona. The dream was still there, a painful, beautiful ghost that haunted her. Now, the furthest they could travel was to a doctor's appointment across town, and the only art she saw was in the pages of books she was too tired to fully appreciate. The memory was a cruel reminder of a path not taken, a life unlived. The phone calls were the worst. They always came during the dinner hour, a calculated intrusion. The voices on the other end were professionally polite but carried an unyielding pressure. They spoke of outstanding balances and payment plans, their sterile language failing to mask the raw threat underneath. Ilara would stand in the hallway, the phone pressed hard against her ear, her voice low and steady as she negotiated, promised, and pleaded. She would use words like hardship and circumstances, feeling a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. Each call was a fresh humiliation, a reminder of her powerlessness. She was a competent, trusted assistant to one of the most powerful men in the city, yet she couldn't protect her own small family from the relentless, impersonal machinery of debt. It was an irony so bitter it felt like poison in her veins. Eleanor, in her gentle way, contributed to the pressure without ever realizing it. She would talk about the daughter of a neighbor who had just gotten engaged to a lovely, stable young man. Her eyes would shine with a wistful hope. "You deserve a life of your own, Ilara," she'd say, her voice soft. "A home, a family, someone to take care of you." The words were meant as an expression of love, a mother's deepest wish for her child's happiness. But to Ilara, they felt like another set of bars reinforcing her cage. How could she even think of dating, of building a life with someone, when every spare moment and every dollar was already claimed? Her mother's vision of a conventional, secure future was a world away from Ilara's own buried desires for art and travel, and the chasm between their dreams felt like another secret she had to keep. The guilt was a constant, low-grade fever in her soul. It was a treacherous emotion, twisting her love for her mother into a sense of obligation and her own dreams into a selfish betrayal. She would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind a battlefield. One part of her, the dutiful daughter, knew she was doing the only thing she could do, the right thing. But another smaller voice, a voice that sounded like her younger self, would whisper of Florence, of passion, of a life that was hers and hers alone. The desire for that life felt like a profound act of treason against the woman who had given her everything. She was caught in an impossible emotional vice, torn between two non-negotiable loves, the love for her mother and the desperate, nascent love for a self she had not yet been allowed to meet. Her world had become a diptych of opposing realities. By day, she navigated a landscape of immense, almost obscene wealth, where a casual lunch cost more than their weekly grocery budget. She poured coffee into cups worth hundreds of dollars and scheduled meetings on private jets. Then, she would take the bus home to a reality of expired coupons, late notices, and the quiet hum of a rented oxygen machine. The constant, jarring transition between these two extremes was beginning to fray her nerves, making her feel like a foreigner in both places. She belonged neither to the world of power and privilege, nor to the vibrant community outside her door. She was an island, Adrift in a sea of responsibility, her only view the unyielding brick wall outside her window, a perfect, final symbol of her beautiful, suffocating prison. Julian Thorne was not a man. He was an institution, a name whispered with a mixture of awe and terror in the boardrooms of Chicago. He existed primarily as a presence, a palpable shift in the atmosphere whenever he entered a room. His office, occupying the entire top floor, was a minimalist cathedral of glass and steel, offering a god's-eye view of the city he so ruthlessly conquered daily. At 38, he was carved from a colder, harder material than other men. His dark hair was impeccably styled, his custom-tailored suits were like armor, and his movements were economical and precise, betraying no wasted energy. His reputation as a corporate predator was well-earned. He dismantled companies with the detached, surgical skill of a master who found no joy in the process, only a grim, necessary finality. He was a king in a silent, isolated kingdom of his own making. This fortress of emotional detachment had been built brick by painful brick. Years prior, Julian had been the subject of a brutal public humiliation. His fiancée, a woman he had allowed into the guarded inner sanctum of his life, had not only been unfaithful, but had systematically sold his corporate secrets to his most dangerous rival. The betrayal was absolute. Confirming his darkest suspicions about human nature, he concluded that love was merely a transaction cloaked in sentiment, and vulnerability was a weakness to be purged. Now he trusted only in the cold, hard certainty of contracts, their clauses and subclauses a bulwark against the chaos of human emotion. He was surrounded by opulence but was profoundly alone, the immense wealth serving only to heighten the walls between himself and a world he no longer believed in. The summons came through an instant message on her desktop, a single, stark line devoid of any preamble. "Ms. Vance, my office, now." The words landed like stones in the pit of her stomach. A direct summons was rare. Julian Thorne communicated through layers of technology and protocol. Alara rose, her movements stiff, and smoothed down her simple black skirt. The walk from her cubicle to the heavy oak doors of his office felt like a journey across a barren wasteland. The plush carpet absorbed the sound of her footsteps, creating an unnerving silence broken only by the frantic thumping of her own heart. The air grew colder, the light more severe. Each polished surface reflected a distorted, pale version of herself, a ghost walking toward the source of all power in her universe, a man she served but barely knew. She pushed the door open to a space that felt less like an office and more like the edge of the world. 3 walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, and the city of Chicago sprawled below, a toy set of glittering towers and sprawling highways. The room was stark, dominated by a massive black desk that seemed carved from a single piece of obsidian. And there he was, standing not behind it, but by the window, his back to her, a dark silhouette against the overwhelming panorama. He didn't turn or acknowledge her presence. The silence stretched, thick and deliberate, a tool he wielded with expert precision. Alara stood just inside the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, feeling small and utterly transparent, a specimen brought in for observation. She felt the sheer force of his will in the room, a gravity that bent everything toward him. After a moment that felt like an eternity, he turned. His eyes, the color of a stormy gray sea, swept over her. It was not a lecherous or even a personal gaze. It was an appraisal, a cool, methodical assessment that took in every detail from the tidy knot of her hair to the sensible heels of her shoes. He was cataloging her, weighing her, measuring her for a purpose she could not begin to fathom. Under his inspection, Alara felt a hot flush of awareness, a sense that he was seeing past the efficient assistant, to the core of her, to the anxieties and the desperate hope she kept so carefully hidden. It was invasive and unnerving, yet she couldn't look away. For the first time, she was not an invisible cog in his machine. She was the sole focus of his formidable, undivided attention. "Ms. Vance," he said, and his voice was exactly as she'd imagined, a low, controlled baritone with no trace of warmth, like stones grinding together. "Your performance reports indicate a level of discretion and efficiency that is exceptional." He walked slowly from the window toward his desk, his eyes never leaving her face. The compliment felt less like praise and more like a statement of fact from a research paper. You manage the chaos of my professional life with an almost prescient calm." He stopped, leaving a few feet of charged space between them. "Tell me, are you as adept at managing chaos in your personal life?" The question was a sudden, jarring shift from the professional to the personal, a deliberate probe to see if she would flinch. It was a test, and she knew it. She held his gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I manage what needs to be managed, Mr. Thorne." Her voice was steadier than she felt, a small victory. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a flicker of something that might have been respect crossing his features before vanishing. He moved to his desk, but didn't sit, instead leaning against its sharp edge, crossing his arms. The posture was casual, yet it radiated absolute authority. "Discretion," he mused, his voice dropping slightly, "is a rare commodity. Loyalty, even rarer. Most people are driven by a singular, predictable motivation, self-interest. They will always choose the path that benefits them the most, regardless of the consequences for others. Wouldn't you agree?" His words were a statement on the world, a glimpse into his own bleak, transactional philosophy, and she felt they were aimed directly at her. The atmosphere in the room had changed. The pretense of a standard performance review had evaporated, leaving behind a raw, undefined tension. This was not about her work. This was about Suker. His gaze intensified, no longer just assessing, but searching, as if trying to read the fine print of her soul. He was a predator circling, and she was something he had identified, not as prey, but as a potential piece in a game whose rules were known only to him. "You have a mother," he stated, not asked. "She is unwell." The words were delivered with the same cold detachment as a stock market report, yet they landed like a physical blow. He knew. Of course he knew. He knew everything. The knowledge stripped her of her last layer of armor, leaving her feeling exposed and frighteningly vulnerable before him. In that moment of stark vulnerability, something shifted within Ilara. As he watched her, waiting for her composure to crack, she saw something beyond the cold, calculating billionaire. It was a flicker in his gray eyes, a shadow of profound, deep-seated loneliness. It was in the rigid control of his posture, a defense against a world that had clearly wounded him. The air was thick with his power and her fear, but beneath it, a strange, invisible current began to flow between them. It was a pull, a dangerous and unwelcome magnetic force that had nothing to do with his wealth or status. It was an instinctual recognition of the deep, hidden pain in him, a pain that resonated with the quiet desperation in her own heart. The fascination was terrifying, a spark of warmth in the absolute zero of his presence. He pushed away from the desk, the moment broken. "That will be all for now, Ms. Vance." The dismissal was abrupt, leaving her reeling from the emotional whiplash. As she turned to leave, her hand on the cold metal of the doorknob, his voice stopped her. "Clear my schedule for tomorrow morning. All of it. We have a private matter to discuss here at 9. The command was absolute, its ambiguity a final, calculated move. He didn't look at her as he said it, already turning back to the window and his kingdom of glass and steel. Ilara walked out of his office, the heavy door clicking shut behind her, the sound sealing her in with a terrifying new reality. Her mind was a maelstrom of fear and confusion, but underneath it all was a single, undeniable and horrifying thought. She wanted to know what he would say next. The next morning at 9 o'clock, she entered his office to find it transformed. A small, round table had been placed near the window, set with coffee and a plate of untouched pastries. The imposing desk was now just a part of the background. Julian Thorne was already seated, not in a power position, but as an equal, a gesture so out of character, it immediately set her on edge. He motioned for her to sit. "This is not a negotiation, Miss Vance," he began, his voice a low, even timbre that filled the quiet room. "It is a proposition, a contract." He slid a slim leather-bound folder across the table. The air was still, heavy with the unspoken gravity of what was about to happen. Ilara looked from the folder to his face, searching his unreadable gray eyes for a clue, a hint of the man behind the corporate machine, and found nothing but impenetrable resolve. She opened the folder, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside was a single, elegantly printed document. As she read, the blood drained from her face. It was a comprehensive proposal, detailing a financial arrangement of staggering proportions. He would settle every last one of her mother's medical debts, past, present, and future, through a privately managed trust. He would also fund a full scholarship for her to pursue a master's degree and PhD in art history at any university in the world. The numbers were life-altering, a release from the prison she had accepted as her reality. Then, she reached the clause detailing her obligations. For 6 months, she was to play the role of his devoted fiancé in public. The document was precise, clinical, and utterly devastating. It was a contract to purchase a piece of her life, her integrity. Why? The word was barely a whisper, a breath of disbelief. He leaned back, his expression unchanged. I am finalizing a merger with a Japanese conglomerate. The chairman is a traditionalist. He values family, stability, legacy. He needs to see me as a man who is building something beyond an empire. He said it with such cold, pragmatic logic that it was clear he saw no moral complication. You are intelligent, poised, and you look the part. You are also motivated. The final word hung in the air between them, a polite and brutal acknowledgement of her desperation. He was offering her a golden key to her cage. But the price was the cage itself, refashioned around her in a new, more opulent form. He was not asking her to be a person. He was hiring her to perform a role, and the stage was his entire life. Alara's mind reeled, a storm of conflicting emotions. The shame was immediate and searing. The idea of selling herself, even in this detached way, felt like a violation of her very core. But then, an image of her mother's face, pale and hopeful, flashed in her mind. She thought of the endless pile of bills, the threatening phone calls, the quiet despair of their evenings. This wasn't just about her dreams of Florence. It was about her mother's survival, her peace. Julian watched her, his silence a form of pressure more potent than any argument. He was not coercing her. He was simply laying out the facts of their respective realities. He had a problem that only a performance could solve. She had a problem that only his money could solve. It was a transaction, pure and simple, and in his world, everything had a price. The first few weeks of their arrangement were a blur of calculated instruction. Julian became her reluctant Pygmalion, sculpting her into the perfect fiancé. There were fittings with designers whose names she had only read in magazines. The soft slide of silk and cashmere against her skin feeling alien and unearned. There were lessons in etiquette, where he would correct the angle of her fork, or the way she held a wine glass with a curt, impersonal touch. He gave her a dossier on every major business associate, their wives, their children, their personal histories, expecting her to memorize it like a script. During these sessions, he was relentlessly professional, his voice never rising, his expression never changing. He was building his perfect partner, but he kept a vast, unbridgeable distance between them, ensuring she never forgot she was an employee, not a confidant. Their first public appearance was at a small, exclusive dinner party at the home of a banking magnate. Dressed in a sapphire blue gown that cost more than she earned in a year, Alara felt like an imposter, a child playing dress-up. Julian's hand rested on the small of her back, a proprietary gesture that was meant to look intimate, but felt as cold and hard as stone. She recited her memorized lines, smiled at the appropriate moments, and felt his silent approval. But then, the host, a pompous man named Harrington, gestured to a dark, brooding painting on his wall and made a dismissive comment about modern art. Before she could stop herself, Alara spoke, her voice clear and passionate, explaining the painting's lineage, its emotional power, its place in the post-war expressionist movement. The table fell silent. For the first time, Julian looked at her not as an asset but as a person. A flicker of genuine surprise, perhaps even admiration, crossed his face before his mask of indifference fell back into place. Harrington was stunned into a respectful silence. On the ride home, the air in the limousine was thick with a new kind of tension. "Your knowledge is extensive," Julian said, his gaze fixed on the passing city lights. It was the closest he had come to a genuine compliment. "It was my major," she replied softly, feeling a blush creep up her neck. I love it." In that moment, the transactional nature of their relationship was momentarily forgotten. He had seen a piece of her true self, a part of her that was not for sale, and the knowledge of it created a subtle but significant shift in the power dynamic between them. The encounters grew more frequent, their carefully constructed public narrative solidifying with each charity gala and corporate dinner. Ilara learned to navigate his world with a quiet grace that surprised even herself. She discovered that her genuine interest in people, a quality so at odds with Julian's detached pragmatism, was her greatest asset. She could charm the wives of his rivals by discussing literature and art, creating bridges where he saw only battle lines. He began to rely on her, not just for the performance, a subtle shift in his gaze across a crowded room, a silent question that she would answer with a reassuring nod. He was still her employer, the architect of her gilded cage. But he was also becoming something else, a partner. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. One night, returning late from a fundraiser, exhaustion had worn down both their defenses. As the car moved silently through the sleeping city, she found herself telling him about her mother, about the cello that sat silent in their living room. She spoke of the music her mother used to make, a sound so full of life it felt like the polar opposite of their current existence. Julian didn't speak, but he listened. He turned his body toward her in the dark, his attention absolute. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the car. "She must be a very strong woman," he said finally, his voice rougher than usual. It was a simple statement, but it held a universe of empathy she had never expected from him. It was a crack in his fortress, a glimpse of a man who understood loss, and it made her heart ache with a dangerous, forbidden tenderness. The desire she had so carefully suppressed for her entire life began to awaken, not as a sudden storm, but as a slow, rising tide. It was born in the small, unscripted moments. The way his eyes would find hers across a room, a silent, magnetic pull. The accidental brush of his hand against hers as he passed her a glass of champagne, a jolt of electricity that left her skin tingling, the scent of his cologne, a clean, sharp fragrance of bergamot and cedarwood that lingered in the car long after he was gone. She started to notice the fine lines around his eyes when he was tired, the way his jaw would clench when he was under pressure. She was seeing the man, not the monolith, and the more she saw, the more she wanted, a desire that felt like the most profound betrayal of her principles. The moral dilemma became her constant companion, a shadow that followed her from the opulence of his penthouse to the cramped reality of her apartment. She would look at her mother, sleeping peacefully, her future secured by this lie, and feel a wave of justification. She was doing this for her. But then she would lie awake in her own bed, replaying a conversation with Julian, the memory of his rare, fleeting smile, and feel a deep, agonizing shame. Was she falling for him, or was she simply succumbing to a sophisticated form of Stockholm Syndrome, her gratitude and proximity masquerading as affection? She felt her own identity, her carefully preserved romantic ideals, beginning to erode, and she didn't know if what was replacing it was love or a beautiful, devastating illusion. Julian, too, was fighting a losing battle. He had designed their contract to be a bulwark against emotion, a sterile business arrangement. But he had not accounted for Ilara's quiet power. He found himself seeking her out, manufacturing reasons for them to be in the same room, craving the calming effect of her presence. Her authenticity was a balm on his cynical soul. He started to hate the lie, not because it was immoral, but because it was a barrier between them. He wanted to know her, the real her, the passionate art historian, the devoted daughter. He would watch her, a fierce, protective feeling rising in his chest that he hadn't felt since before his betrayal. This feeling terrified him. It was a weakness, a vulnerability he had sworn never to allow again, and yet it was growing stronger every day. The physical tension between them became an almost unbearable, silent third party in every room. One evening, as they prepared for another event, he came up behind her to fasten the clasp of a diamond necklace. His fingers, cool and steady, brushed against the sensitive skin of her nape. The touch was brief, professional, yet it sent a tremor through her entire body. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. She saw his reflection in the mirror, his gray eyes dark and intense, his jaw tight. He let his fingers linger for a fraction of a second too long, a silent acknowledgement of the current arcing between them. Then he pulled back as if he'd been burned, his expression shuttered and cold once more. The moment passed, but it left an indelible mark. a promise of a fire they were both desperately trying to pretend wasn't there. He became harsher, more demanding in the days that followed, as if trying to punish her and himself for that moment of weakness. He reverted to treating her like an employee, his words clipped and his manner dismissive. The whiplash was dizzying and painful for Ilara. It reinforced the brutal reality of their situation. She was his possession for 6 months, an object he could manipulate as he saw fit. The desire she felt curdled into a confusing mix of anger and hurt. She had allowed herself to see a man who wasn't there, to hope for a connection that was a fantasy. She resolved to rebuild her walls, to remember the contract, to protect the last untouched corner of her heart. She would play her part, take the money, and save her mother. She would not, could not, fall in love with her captor. The turning point came at the annual Chicago Symphony Orchestra Gala, the social centerpiece of the season. It was the kind of event that his ex-fiancée had reveled in. As they walked through the grand foyer, a woman who bore a striking resemblance to his former partner greeted a friend nearby, her laughter echoing in the marble hall. Ilara felt Julian go rigid beside her, his hand on her back tightening like a vice. His face became a pale, expressionless mask, but she saw the flicker of raw pain in his eyes. He was not here with her. He was trapped in a memory, drowning in the ghost of his past betrayal. His vulnerability was a stark, unguarded wound, and every instinct in her screamed to protect him. She saw him start to retreat, to pull away and vanish behind his fortress of ice. Without thinking, without considering the rules of their contract or the watching eyes of Chicago's elite, Ilara acted. She turned to him, her movement fluid and natural, and gently took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. Her touch was not part of the performance. It was a simple, grounding act of human empathy. She didn't say a word, just held his hand firmly, a silent anchor in his storm. He flinched at first, surprised, but then his fingers tightened around hers, clinging to her as if she were a lifeline. He looked down at her, and in that moment, the entire artifice of their arrangement, the contract, the money, the lies, crumbled into dust. In his eyes, she saw not a powerful billionaire or a cynical predator, but a man who was profoundly, desperately lonely and afraid. And he saw in her not a paid employee or a convenient solution, but a source of genuine, unvarnished kindness. The air between them crackled with this terrifying new truth. The world around them, with its glittering chandeliers and polite chatter, faded into an indistinct blur. There was only the two of them, standing on the precipice of something far more dangerous and real than any business deal. The desire that had been simmering beneath the surface now had a name, and it was no longer just a physical wanting. It was an emotional need, a collision of two wounded souls in a crowded room, and neither of them knew how to turn back. He didn't speak. As the limousine glided through the deserted city streets, the silence between them no longer a void but a space, charged with the unspoken truths of the evening. The air was thick with the ghost of her touch on his hand, the memory of his raw vulnerability. When the car turned away from the route to her apartment, her heart leaped into her throat. He leaned forward, his voice low and devoid of its usual command when he spoke to the driver. "Home?" Then he turned to her, his gray eyes searching her face in the intermittent glow of the streetlights. "Don't go," he said, the two words a confession, not an order. "Stay with me." It was a violation of every rule they had established, a transgression against the clean, cold lines of their contract. In that moment, she had to choose between the familiar duty waiting for her at home and the terrifying, unknown territory of this man's soul. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The ascent in his private elevator was a journey into another realm. The polished steel walls reflected their tense, silent figures, two strangers on the brink of an irreversible act. Below them, the glittering tapestry of Chicago shrank, the sounds of the world fading until all that remained was the soft hum of the machinery and the frantic, syncopated rhythm of their breathing. Allura watched his reflection, seeing the rigid set of his shoulders, the muscle working in his jaw. He was as terrified as she was. This was his final fortress, the inner sanctum he had let no one enter since his betrayal, and he was bringing her inside. She knew, with a certainty that was both exhilarating and paralyzing, that when these doors opened, the performance would be over. Whatever happened next would be real, and the consequences would be theirs alone to bear, a shared secret in the sky. His penthouse was a testament to a life of curated solitude. It was a vast, minimalist space of glass, steel, and stone, yet it felt less like a home and more like a museum dedicated to a single, lonely inhabitant. He left the main lights off, allowing the city to illuminate the room in a cool, electric glow. The grand piano stood silent in one corner, its surface veiled with a fine layer of dust, a monument to forgotten passions. A wall of first-edition novels spoke of a mind that sought refuge in other worlds. He had brought her here, into the heart of his isolation, and the stark beauty of the space was a reflection of the man himself, powerful, controlled, and aching with an emptiness that the view from the 50th floor could never fill. She felt like an intruder in a sacred, wounded place, the first living thing to be welcomed into his beautiful, gilded cage. He walked to the massive wall of glass, his back to her, a dark silhouette against the sprawling universe of lights. The posture was a familiar defense, but the tension in his frame was new. The contract was a mistake, he said, his voice rough, stripped bare of its corporate armor. It was the sound of a man admitting defeat. I designed it to be impenetrable, a transaction, no emotion, no risk. He paused, his breath fogging a small patch of the window before vanishing. I built my entire world on the principle that vulnerability is a fatal weakness. I never accounted for you, Alara. I never accounted for your kindness. He finally turned to face her, and his eyes were dark with a storm of conflict, pain, and a terrifying, unfamiliar hope. I didn't account for feeling this. The confession hung between them, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their arrangement. The power in the room had inverted. He was no longer the master of her fate. He was a supplicant, laying his wounded soul at her feet. He moved to a discreet panel in the wall, which slid open to reveal a small, hidden safe. From it, he retrieved the slim leather folder that contained her servitude and her salvation. He didn't open it. He simply held it in his hands, the physical manifestation of the lie that had brought them together. "This document is meaningless," he said, his voice tight with an emotion she couldn't name. "It was a shield. But I don't want to hide from you." He took a step toward her, holding the folder out as if it were an offering. "I will uphold my end of the bargain. Your mother, your education. It's all yours. You are free. But I'm asking you, not as your employer but as a man, to stay." Ilara looked from the folder to his face, a landscape of fear and longing she was just beginning to learn how to read. She saw the ghost of his past betrayal and the cautious hope in his eyes, the terror of offering his trust again. Her carefully constructed walls, her romantic ideals, the shame of their arrangement, it all crumbled in the face of this raw, unvarnished truth. This complicated, wounded man was offering her the one thing she never believed she would find, a connection that felt terrifyingly, undeniably real. She closed the distance between them, her step sure and silent on the cold marble floor. She reached out, but instead of taking the folder, her fingers gently closed over his. She took the contract from his grasp and placed it on a nearby table, a discarded relic of a life that no longer existed. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. His exhale was a shuddering release of tension held for years. He lifted his hand, his fingers trembling, and gently brushed a stray lock of honey-blonde hair from her cheek. The touch was not the calculated, proprietary gesture of their public appearances. It was hesitant, reverent, a question asked in the universal language of skin on skin. A jolt, pure and sharp, shot through her, awakening every nerve ending that had lain dormant for a lifetime. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes, a silent act of complete and total surrender. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, a slow, deliberate caress that felt more intimate than any kiss. In that single, tender gesture, she felt seen, not as an asset or a role, but as herself. The virginity she had guarded was not a wall, but a waiting, and the wait was finally over. When his lips met hers, it was with the cautious exploration of a man relearning a forgotten language. The kiss was not about passion, but about recognition, a soft, searching pressure that spoke of years of loneliness, and a desperate, burgeoning hope. It was a taste of his soul, the bitterness of his past, and the tentative sweetness of this moment. She responded with the entirety of her own pent-up life, pouring her quiet desperation, her secret dreams of Florence, and her fierce, devoted heart into the embrace. It was the first truly selfish act of her adult life, and the most honest. The city lights blurred into a watercolor of emotion through her tear-filled eyes. In the silent sanctuary of his penthouse, high above the world, their lie died, and something beautiful and terrifying was born from its ashes. He broke the kiss only to lift her into his arms, his strength a startling contrast to the gentleness of his embrace. He carried her from the cold marble of the living space into the stark intimacy of his bedroom. The room was a continuation of his fortress, dominated by a large, unadorned bed and another wall of glass that made them feel as if they were suspended in the night sky. He laid her down on the cool, crisp sheets, his movements filled with a reverence that made her ache. As he slowly, carefully undressed her, his gaze was not one of conquering lust, but of profound, unadulterated awe. Every layer of clothing removed felt like another layer of the contract being peeled away, revealing the vulnerable, trembling truth of the woman beneath. This was not a transaction, it was a revelation, a willing gift of the one part of her she had kept sacred. Their final union was not a storm, but a quiet, profound merging, a sacred silence after a lifetime of noise. For him, it was the ultimate act of surrender, allowing her past every defense into the most guarded part of himself. For her, it was the final, beautiful release of a dream she had held so tightly, it had almost suffocated her. This was not the idealized fantasy from her novels. It was messy, real, and infinitely more precious. Bathed in the cold, distant starlight of the city, they moved together, two solitary souls forging a new world in the ruins of their old ones. It was a silent, binding contract of the heart, signed not with ink, but with the searing, indelible mark of two people choosing to be vulnerable together, shattering their gilded cages and stepping into a terrifying, uncertain, but shared freedom. The first light of dawn crept into the penthouse, a soft pearlescent gray that painted the steel and glass in hues of hope. Alara awoke slowly, cocooned in the unfamiliar scent of his sheets, and the profound, unprecedented feeling of peace. She was not in her cramped room, listening for the sound of her mother's strained breathing, but in a silent sanctuary in the sky. She turned to watch Julian sleep, his face stripped of its usual guarded severity, looking younger, almost vulnerable. The memory of the night, of his confession, and their gentle, reverent union, was a warm, living thing inside her. For the first time, she felt not like an accessory to a life, but the center of one. In the quiet stillness of the morning, she allowed herself to believe that this fragile, impossible reality might actually be her own, a dream from which she wouldn't have to wake. The spell was broken by the insistent, angry buzz of a phone on the nightstand. Julian stirred, his brow furrowing in annoyance. He reached for it, his intention clearly to silence the intrusion, to preserve the sanctity of their morning. But his eyes caught the screen, and Alara watched in real time as the man she had held all night vanished, replaced by the formidable, impenetrable CEO of Thorn Capital. His body went rigid, the soft lines of his face hardening into a mask of cold fury. He didn't speak, but a glacial chill radiated from him, instantly freezing the warmth between them. She felt it like a physical blow, the sudden, terrifying return of the distance he had so painstakingly erased just hours before. The world they had built in the darkness was being invaded by the harsh light of day, and she knew with a sickening certainty that it was about to be torn apart. Without a word, he handed her the phone. The screen glowed with the garish headline of a notorious online tabloid, "Thorn's Tender Trap, Billionaire Buys His Bride." Beneath it, a grainy photo of them at the gala, his hand on her back, was juxtaposed with leaked details of their contract. The cold, transactional language, the financial figures, the 6-month term, the unspoken obligations, was laid bare for the world to see. Every beautiful, genuine moment they had shared was instantly poisoned, reframed as a sordid, calculated performance. The air left her lungs in a painful rush. The intimacy they had shared, the one pure thing she had ever claimed for herself, was now a cheap, humiliating commodity, consumed and judged by millions of strangers. The shame was so absolute, so suffocating it felt like drowning in ice. "You need to go." The words were clipped, devoid of any emotion, the voice of a commander issuing orders in a crisis. Julian was already out of bed, pacing, his mind clearly racing through strategies, legal actions, and public relations maneuvers. He wasn't looking at her, wasn't seeing the devastation on her face. He saw a liability, a complication in a hostile takeover of his life. "I'll have a car take you. We can't be seen together. I need to contain this." Each sentence was a hammer blow, rebuilding the wall between them brick by brutal brick. He was pushing her away, ejecting her from his life, with the same clinical efficiency he used to dismantle companies. He was protecting his empire, and in that moment, she understood with chilling clarity that she was, and perhaps always had been, just a fragile, disposable part of it. The silent ride back to her apartment was a journey through a landscape of shame. Every person on the street felt like an accuser, every passing car a witness to her humiliation. The city that had looked like a kingdom of possibility from his window now felt like a vast public courtroom where she had already been judged and found wanting. She huddled in the corner of the plush leather seat, the luxurious car feeling like a cage on wheels, a final, mocking reminder of the world she had briefly touched but would never belong to. She was the girl from the tabloids, the assistant who sold herself for her mother's medical bills. The truth of her desperation didn't matter. The world would only see the transaction, and she would forever be branded by the cold, hard print of the contract he had torn up in a moment of what now felt like a devastatingly cruel illusion. She opened the door to her apartment to find her mother sitting in her armchair, her laptop open on her knees, her face a mask of pale, heartbroken disbelief. Eleanor didn't rage or cry. Her silence was far worse. "I saw," she whispered, her voice fragile. The look in her eyes was not one of judgment, but of a deep, profound sorrow that cut Ilara to the core. This was the consequence she hadn't let herself imagine, that in trying to save her mother's life, she had destroyed her mother's image of her. She had brought the ugliness of Julian Thorne's world into their small, quiet sanctuary. "Is this what he did to you, my star?" Eleanor asked, her question encompassing so much more than the public scandal. It was a question about Ilara's soul, and Ilara had no answer that wouldn't break both their hearts. In his glass fortress, Julian waged a war. He unleashed his lawyers, his publicists, his investigators, a ruthless army designed to cauterize the wound. He moved with a cold, terrifying precision, his fury a tightly controlled inferno. Yet when the calls were done and the threats were made, he was left in the echoing silence of his penthouse. The scent of her still lingered on his pillows, a ghost of the vulnerability he had allowed himself for a single night. The world's attack confirmed his oldest, darkest fear, that to open his heart was to invite destruction. He had let her in, and in doing so, he had exposed her to the brutal machinery of his life. The urge to pull her back, to protect her, was at war with the savage, ingrained instinct to lock the gates and never let anyone in again. He was trapped, alone with his rage and a new, terrifying ache of loss. Days bled into a silent, gray week. The trust for her mother's care was activated with impersonal efficiency, a deposit appearing in an account as if by magic. The money was a reality, a tangible proof of their bargain, yet it felt like an accusation. Ilara moved through her days in a fog of muted grief. There was no word from Julian. The silence from his end was absolute, a confirmation that their connection had been severed as cleanly as a business deal concluded. She tortured herself with questions. Was his confession just a final, masterful negotiation to secure the contract's implicit clause? Had she been a fool to believe in the wounded man behind the mask? She had traded her integrity for her mother's future, but she now feared she had lost both, destroying the one beautiful, real thing she had ever known in the process. Then, in the depths of her quiet despair, something began to shift. She was cleaning, a mindless, repetitive task, when she found the crumpled insurance rejection letter that had been her breaking point. She held it in one hand, a symbol of her powerlessness. In her other hand, she held her phone, displaying the new, stable balance of the trust account. She had been backed into a corner, faced with an impossible choice, and she had acted. She had not been a passive victim. She had been a reluctant warrior. The shame that had been suffocating her began to loosen its grip, replaced by a nascent, unfamiliar feeling: resilience. The world could judge her, Julian could abandon her, but she could not deny the truth. She had faced the dragon of her desperation and walked out of the fire, burned and scarred, but alive, and, for the first time, truly on her own. A new resolve settled over her, as quiet and certain as the dawn. She would not be defined by a tabloid headline or a man's silence. Her life was not an addendum to his. She walked to her bookshelf and ran her fingers over the spines of her art history texts, the forgotten language of her own soul. The education he had promised was not a gift from him, but a future she had earned with her own sacrifice. Whether his love had been real or an illusion, her dream was not. She would go to Florence. She would stand before the works of the masters, not as an escape, but as a reclamation. She would build a life from the wreckage, one that belonged to no one but herself. The contract was over, but her story, she realized with a surge of terrifying, exhilarating clarity, was just beginning. A year had passed, and Florence was not an escape, but a homecoming for a soul she was just getting to know. The Alara who stood in the Uffizi gallery, bathed in the soft, ethereal light filtering from a high window, was a different woman. Her hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and her eyes, once clouded with the weary weight of duty, were clear and sharp, absorbing the impossible beauty of Botticelli's Venus. She had earned this. Every hushed footstep on the cool terracotta floors, every scent of ancient dust and lemon groves drifting in from the Boboli Gardens, was a verse in a poem she was finally writing for herself. The ache for Julian remained, a phantom limb of memory, but it no longer defined her. It was simply a part of her story, the dark, rich pigment that gave the rest of her life's canvas its depth and contrast. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a postcard from her mother and a notice from the university library. The envelope was made of heavy, cream-colored stock, the kind of paper that felt like money and power. There was no return address, but the postmark was from Chicago, and the handwriting addressing it to Signorina Vance was an elegant, angular script she would have recognized in her sleep. Her heart seized, a violent, painful clench in her chest. For a long moment, she simply stood in the entryway of her small, sun-drenched apartment, the letter feeling as heavy as a stone in her hand. To open it was to risk reopening a wound she had so carefully, painstakingly stitched closed. To leave it sealed was to live forever with the ghost of a question. Her fingers, trembling slightly, broke the seal, choosing the painful truth over the hollow safety of ignorance. The words inside were not an apology. They were a confession, stripped of all artifice. Julian wrote not of the scandal or his business, but of the silence that followed. He described the echoing emptiness of his penthouse, how her absence had given it a final, unbearable permanence. He admitted his fear had been greater than his love, that in his terror of being destroyed again, he had preemptively destroyed the one real thing in his life. He didn't ask her to forgive him or to return. He simply wanted her to know that the man she had met that night, the one who had confessed his feelings and torn up their contract, was the only true version of himself he had known in years. He ended the letter by saying he had bought a small, obscure Renaissance painting of St. Lucy, the patron saint of sight, because her passionate eyes reminded him of the way Alara had taught him to truly see. She wept as she read, not tears of renewed sorrow, but of a profound, cleansing release. The letter was a key, unlocking the last chamber of her heart where she had imprisoned her anger and doubt. It had been real. His feelings, his vulnerability, his love, they had all been real. The knowledge was a balm, soothing the jagged edges of her memory. She looked around her apartment, at the stacks of books, the charcoal sketches pinned to the wall, the view of a terracotta rooftop garden from her window. This life, this beautiful, quiet, scholarly life was hers. It had been bought with a painful price, but it was hers nonetheless. Julian's contract, born of his deepest cynicism, had inadvertently become her liberation. And his final act, not of tearing up the paper but of letting her go completely, was the cruelest and kindest gift he could have ever given her. That evening, as the sky over the Arno bled into shades of rose and gold, Elara walked to the center of the Ponte Santa Trinita. She didn't need to write back. Their story was not one for letters. It was a thing of silent moments, of shared glances and unspoken truths. She took his letter from her pocket and read it one last time, the words a final, bittersweet benediction. She memorized the shape of his handwriting, the raw honesty of his pain, and the quiet love embedded in his confession. Then, with a gentle, deliberate motion, she folded the heavy paper into a small, neat square. She held it over the ancient stone railing for a moment before opening her hand. It was not an act of rejection or forgetting, but of release. She was setting his ghost free, and with it, the last vestiges of the girl she used to be. She watched the small white square drift on the current, a tiny vessel carrying the weight of their impossible story, until it was swallowed by the river's shimmering reflection of the twilight sky. A profound sense of peace, quiet and complete, settled over her. Her future was no longer a debt to be paid or a dream to be deferred. It was a vast, open landscape waiting for her brushstroke. Perhaps their paths would cross again in a different city, a different lifetime, when they were two different people. Or perhaps this was the end, a perfect, poignant closing chapter. Turning from the river, a small, genuine smile touched her lips as she walked back toward the warm, inviting lights of the Oltrarno district. She was finally, irrevocably, home. If their journey moved you, please subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments, letting this story travel as far as their love did.